Welcome to today's deep dive. Electric vehicles.
EVs.
That's right, EVs.
Yeah.
A topic you probably think you know a lot about already.
Definitely a hot topic.
It is. But today,
Yeah.
we're going beyond the usual headlines, all that going green stuff.
Right. Digging a little deeper.
Exactly. We're diving deep into all the nitty-gritty, the stuff that they don't always put in those shiny EV ads.
The stuff that's maybe a little less glamorous.
Yeah, for sure. So to guide us on this journey, we've got a talk by Mark P. Mills.
Physicist.
Yep, a physicist. And he had some really thought-provoking things to say about EVs. He was speaking at Hillsdale College and
Yeah, some interesting points.
definitely points that challenge that simple narrative. We often hear about EVs.
The kind of good versus bad oversimplification.
Exactly. So are you ready to unpack this with us? We're going to look at the real cost of EVs.
Financial and environmental.
Both. We'll explore why those batteries are so complex.
Yeah, why does that matter?
Well, we're going to find out. And we'll even touch on how politics plays into this whole EV revolution.
Can't escape politics, can we?
All right, it's everywhere. All right, you ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
Okay, so one of the most fascinating things Mills points out is that we keep hearing about this post-car culture.
Especially among young people.
Right, like they're all ditching cars.
Embracing ride sharing and public transit.
That's the narrative anyway, but the data tells a totally different story.
Totally.
So what's the real story? Because I remember seeing articles about how Gen Z isn't as interested in cars as older generations.
Yeah, well, the reality is young people still overwhelmingly want cars.
Really?
Yeah, it's just that many of them can't afford them.
Makes sense, especially with the crazy cost of living these days.
Exactly. They still see car ownership as this symbol of freedom, being able to go where you want when you want.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. You're just starting out.
Maybe you got student loans.
Rent is insane.
Yeah, and then buying any car, let alone a pricey EV, feels like a distant dream.
Totally.
Yeah.
And that leads us to another myth about EVs, that they're simpler than gas cars because they have fewer moving parts.
Yeah, simpler, because less moving parts, right?
Yeah. But that's only part of the story.
And Mills does a great job of debunking this.
Right. This is where it gets really interesting, right? Because when you picture an EV in your head, it's like electric motor,
Battery.
done. Simple, right?
Supposedly.
But Mills says that simplicity is kind of an illusion.
In a way, it
Let's
is.
say that.
Think of it this way. With a gas car, you've got this complex engine under the hood.
Right.
With EVs, that complexity has moved to the battery.
Oh, interesting.
Instead of a thermodynamic burning fuel, you have an electrochemical engine storing and releasing energy.
Okay.
And those batteries, they're incredibly sophisticated.
I never really thought about it like that.
Thousands of individual parts, intricate cooling systems, all sorts of safety features.
So it's like trading one kind of complexity for another.
You could say that.
But why does that matter?
Because complexity equals cost.
Ah, I see.
Those intricate batteries are a major reason why EVs are so expensive to manufacture.
And that higher price tag is a huge barrier for a lot of potential buyers.
Absolutely.
So we're already seeing that this simple EV narrative,
Not so simple.
not so simple at all. There's this whole hidden layer of complexity.
Yeah.
And that complexity translates directly into dollars. And I have a feeling this connects to the environmental impact of EVs.
You think?
Right. Because we keep hearing they're this green solution, but Mills raises some serious questions about that too.
He does.
Yeah. So he says even though EVs don't have tailpipes spewing emissions.
Their production process creates a significant tailpipe elsewhere.
Okay, so what are we talking about here? Where is that tailpipe located?
Think about all the materials that go into an EV battery.
Okay.
Lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements.
Right.
Extracting and refining those materials requires a huge amount of energy, and a lot of that energy still comes from fossil fuels.
Oh.
We're talking massive mining operations, often located in countries with less strict environmental regulations.
So we're starting to see the bigger picture here. Even though EVs aren't burning gas directly, there's this whole upstream environmental cost that's often overlooked.
Right, and
Mills has a stat that really drives this point home. He says it takes something like 500,000 pounds of rock to produce one 1,000-pound EV battery.
that's a lot of rock.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it?
It is.
It's a stark reminder that EV production isn't this magical clean process.
Yeah,
There are real environmental trade-offs to consider.
for sure.
And this leads us to another piece of the puzzle, one that's definitely got some political angles.
Mm.
Those government subsidies for EVs.
Ah, yes, the subsidies.
Because we keep hearing about how governments are throwing money at EVs to make them more affordable.
Trying to make them more appealing to consumers?
Right. But Mills points out a pretty strange paradox here, doesn't he?
He does.
So what is it?
Because even with those hefty subsidies...
We're talking tens of thousands of dollars per car in some cases.
Yeah, huge amounts.
Some EV manufacturers are still losing money on every vehicle they sell.
Not turning a profit.
Seriously, so taxpayers are footing this huge bill.
Big bills.
But even with that, help EV makers aren't turning a profit.
That's the reality right now.
Wow. So that raises some important questions about the long-term sustainability of this approach.
Yeah.
I mean, how long can these subsidies last?
Yeah.
What are the unintended consequences of artificially propping up a market?
Lots to think about.
Those are big questions, and I have a feeling they tie into the different political viewpoints on EVs that Mills touches on. So let's unpack that next. But first, I think we need a quick pause to let all this sink in. We've covered a lot of ground already, and there's still more to explore.
Definitely more to come. Back to those subsidies.
Yeah, and it's wild how those financial questions tie directly into political perspectives on EVs. You know, it's easy to think about EVs just as like a tech issue.
A tech thing, right?
But as we're seeing, it's so much more complex than that, that there are serious economic and environmental angles,
All intertwined.
and they're tangled up with politics.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head.
So Mills points out that there's like this pretty clear divide in how different political groups view the move to EVs.
The whole EV transition.
And it's not just about, you know, green or not green.
It goes way deeper.
Yeah, so let's break down that divide a bit. I'm curious to hear how these political philosophies play out in the EV world.
Okay, so on one side, you've got folks who think the government should be really pushing EVs.
Pushing hard.
Yeah, even if it means using mandates and those big subsidies we were talking about,
Okay.
they say this is necessary to jumpstart the market, drive innovation.
And get more EVs on the road faster.
Right. From their perspective, it's about taking action now, even if it costs taxpayers some money up front.
But what's the counter to that? What are the concerns on the other side?
So the other side is more for a hands-off approach.
Okay.
They're skeptical of those big government programs.
Right.
They think the market should decide which technologies win out.
So it's a classic debate.
Government intervention versus free market forces.
Exactly. And as you said, it's not as simple as EVs being good or bad. Both sides have points, and it's about weighing those trade-offs.
It really is.
So as listeners, you know, we're trying to make sense of all this. Where do we fit in? How do we navigate all of this when we're just bombarded with information from everywhere?
Well, I think this is where critical thinking is so important.
Okay, so how do we do that?
It's not about just accepting one narrative or the other.
Right.
It's about questioning those assumptions, digging deeper into the evidence,
And being willing to hear different viewpoints.
even if we don't agree with them.
Yeah, and honestly, challenging our own biases too.
Absolutely, we all have our preconceived notions.
And it's easy to fall into that trap of only looking for information that confirms what we already think.
Right, staying in our own little echo chambers.
But to really understand something as complex as this EV thing,
We've got to break out of those echo chambers.
exactly, true. Understanding comes from wrestling with those opposing viewpoints, even if they make us a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, and it's about actively seeking out reliable information, doing our own research.
And being open to changing our minds.
If the evidence shows us we need to.
I love that idea of active research. And
Yeah.
Mills actually gives some pretty practical advice for anyone who wants to dig deeper into this.
What's he say?
He says, don't underestimate the power of Google.
Good old Google.
He says, Google, for all its flaws,
Well, its problem.
can be a really powerful tool for uncovering basic info.
I wouldn't have thought that.
Yeah, he's like, want to know where those battery materials come from, how much energy it takes to mine and refine them?
Google it.
Google it.
I like that.
You'd be surprised how much you can learn just by starting with a simple search.
I bet.
It's about taking ownership of our learning.
Yeah.
You know, not just passively taking in what we're told.
Becoming active participants.
So we've talked about the complexities of EVs, the environmental impact, the economics, the politics. It's a lot.
It's a lot to process.
But taking a step back, where does all this lead? What does it mean for the future of getting around, you know, transportation in general?
That's the big question, right?
It is.
No one has a crystal ball, but one thing's clear. The future is unlikely to be a one-size-fits-all solution.
So you're saying EVs aren't going to be like
The only thing.
the only thing on the road?
Exactly. Mills actually makes the point that EVs are kind of like a niche product right now,
Interesting.
like a specialty car,
Okay.
rather than this revolutionary technology that's going to replace all gas-powered vehicles overnight.
That's an interesting way to think about it. It reminds me of like those early days of the automobile
Yeah.
when people thought cars were just a fad.
A toy for the rich.
Uh, but as we know, that wasn't the case.
It wasn't?
And the transition from horses to cars wasn't this like sudden shift either.
Right. It took decades for cars to become the main way to get around.
And even today, we still use horses for certain things.
Exactly.
So are you suggesting that EVs might be similar? A gradual change rather than a sudden one?
I think that's realistic. Yeah, and the shift to EVs or whatever other technology has come along.
Right. 'Cause who knows what's coming next?
It's going to be shaped by so many factors. We're talking tech innovation, consumer preferences, government policies, global economic trends.
It's all connected.
It really is.
Okay, that makes sense. Recognizing all that complexity, what does it mean for us as individuals? It can feel overwhelming to think about these big trends. So what are some concrete steps we can take to make good choices?
Yeah.
Maybe even influence things in a positive way.
I think it starts with becoming more aware consumers.
More conscious.
Yeah, when we're thinking about buying a car, whether it's electric or gas powered, we can consider the full life cycle costs.
Not just the sticker price.
Right, not just what it costs up front, but also fuel or electricity maintenance, and even what happens to the car at the end of its life.
So the whole picture.
Exactly, and we can think about the environmental impact of our choices. Where are the materials coming from? How much energy does it take to make the car?
Those are good questions to ask.
Regardless of what kind of car we choose.
And you're bringing it back to those individual choices.
Yeah.
Because sometimes these huge issues can make us feel powerless.
For sure.
But it's our choices together that shape the market. And speaking of shaping things, what about getting involved in politics?
That's huge too. We can contact our elected officials, voice our concerns, and advocate for policies that we believe in.
Whether it's supporting incentives for EVs.
Investing in public transit, promoting research into alternative fuels.
There are so many ways to get involved.
I can have the difference.
So it all comes back to being informed, engaged citizens who are willing to think critically and participate in building the future.
Building the future we want.
And speaking of the future, we've talked a lot about the challenges and complexities of EVs, but what about the positives? What's the potential upside here?
That's a great point. It's easy to get caught up in the downsides, but there are some real benefits that EVs could bring, both for us as individuals and for society as a whole.
So that's a perfect segue into the final part of our deep dive.
Oh, yeah.
We've laid the groundwork, explored the complexities, and now let's shift gears and look at the potential bright spots, the opportunities that this tech might hold.
The exciting stuff.
So join us as we wrap up our exploration of the fascinating world of electric vehicles. Welcome back to the final part of our EV deep dive.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It has. We really dug into all the complexities around these EVs.
We did, didn't we? From those hidden costs.
To the political battles.
It's been a lot.
We've covered some serious ground, but I think it's important as we wrap up to highlight the potential upsides.
The good stuff.
Yeah, the reasons why people are so excited about EVs in the first place.
Right, we need that balance.
We do. We need to look at both sides.
Exactly. And I think this is where the individual benefits really come into focus. Like, for starters, think about fuel costs.
Oh, yeah.
Electricity is usually cheaper than gasoline, so you could save a good chunk of change over the life of your EV.
Especially with gas prices all over the place.
It's unpredictable.
Yeah, that peace of mind is pretty appealing. And then there's just the actual driving experience itself. You know,
Yeah.
EV owners rave about that instant torque, the smooth acceleration.
It's different.
Yeah, it's a whole different feeling.
It is, and that actually ties into another benefit. Performance EVs can be super quick off the line.
Zoom.
Yeah, very responsive. It can be fun to drive.
I've heard some people say it feels like driving a spaceship.
I can see that.
But let's not forget about the environmental piece. Even though we talk about all the issues with making EVs,
The production side of things.
right, the cars themselves don't have any tailpipe emissions.
That's huge. That's a key point. Once they're on the road, they're not contributing to local air pollution like gas cars do.
So that's a big plus for cities that have air quality problems.
Definitely.
So we've talked about benefits for EV owners, but what about the bigger picture? Could this shift to EVs have like a positive impact on society as a whole?
There's definitely potential there.
Okay, so what do you see as that potential?
Well, as we move towards electric transportation, we could see a decrease in how much we depend on foreign oil,
Oh, interesting.
which would have major consequences for energy security and, the whole global political landscape.
Geopolitics.
Yeah, exactly. If we're not so reliant on oil from other countries, it gives us more stability.
More independence.
Right. And As renewables like solar and wind become more common, the electricity used for those EVs could get even cleaner.
So it's not just about the cars, it's about how EVs fit into this bigger shift toward clean energy.
You got it.
Okay, that makes sense. And this actually brings up another fascinating point that Mills makes. He says EVs aren't just vehicles, they're basically huge batteries on wheels.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, what does that mean? How do EVs being batteries change things?
Think about it. We're moving toward a future with more and more renewable energy. But one of the big challenges with things like solar and wind is that they're not always available.
Right, the sun's not always shining.
Exactly, and the wind's not always blowing.
So you need a way to store that energy when it's plentiful,
And then release it when you need it.
when there's a shortage.
Right, and that's where EVs could come in.
Oh, I see.
Those batteries in the EVs could actually help to stabilize the electric grid, smooth out those ups and downs in energy production.
So instead of EVs just using electricity, they could be part of making the whole system more efficient.
That's the idea. It's not just about the car itself, it's about how EVs fit into a smarter energy ecosystem.
So one that's more flexible and more powered by renewables.
Exactly.
Wow. So we went from talking about cars to talking about the entire future of energy.
It's all connected, right?
Yeah, that's the power of a deep dive.
It makes you think bigger.
It forces us to look beyond just the surface and, realize that there are rarely simple answers.
Yeah, definitely.
So I think that's a perfect takeaway for our listeners today.
A good one.
We've explored EVs, all the challenges, the opportunities, all the stuff we just don't know yet.
Yeah, a lot of unknowns.
And it's important to remember that this is a story that's still being written. The technology is changing, the market's changing, what it all means. Well, that's changing too.
It's evolving.
It is. So as we wrap up, I want to encourage everyone to stay curious. Keep learning.
Keep digging.
Yeah, engage in these conversations and make choices that feel right for you.
Choices that align with your values.
Because the decisions we make today, they shape the world of tomorrow.
They really do.
And that world is probably going to include a whole bunch of different transportation options, not just one winner.
A mix of things.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of electric vehicles. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those wheels turning.